Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
Charismatic sociopaths, player freedom, huge open worlds, and the sudden but inevitable betrayal by your allies.
Sorry, kid, but like I told you, every patriot I know is a son of a bitch!
These are the things that make Far Cry tick, but over the past 14 years, the series has seen numerous highs and lows, not to mention controversies that have even resulted in copies being pulled from store shelves. With the 5th installment taking place on American soil and already making headlines, it seems like a good time to look back at the history of the Far Cry games. Everything begins in 2004 with the original Far Cry. Released exclusively for PC, the game was set on a mysterious group of islands in the South Pacific, which were home to various genetically altered beasts, mercenaries, and a mad scientist.
So I am free to do my work without interference from the outside world. This work will take time, but a measure of the future of mankind depends on the success of my research here. I will not fail my destiny.
This combination of exotic environment and legions of hired goons to murder in whichever way you see fit would become a core part of the Far Cry franchise going forward. Early elements of stealth mechanics would also be present, however the enemy's AI was often acutely aware of your presence even when actively playing stealthily, and this would cause a lot of frustration amongst players. However, it was still widely praised by critics, and although it didn't reach the dizzying sales heights of other games released that year, such as GTA San Andreas, it still did well enough to warrant a sequel. However, just like San Andreas, Far Cry was also caught up in its own controversy. The game had been developed by Crytek, a German company, but after the release of a demo, German authorities found the level of violence to be too high, even for adults, and stopped it from being distributed. Their main issues were the gore and the ragdoll physics, and when the German version of the full game was released, these features were removed and it was given an 18+ rating. However, that was far from the end of the story, as soon after release, gamers found that with a slight modification to the files in the game's directory, they could return the game to its original, uncensored version. In response, German authorities pulled the game from shelves and shut down the official German website and forums. It wasn't until a few weeks later that a new version was finally released, now without the possibility to revert the changes. As for the rest of the world, the game only generated a couple headlines. San Andreas was soaking up most of the mainstream public outrage at that time, and Far Cry slipped under the radar.
If you're a parent, there are some other things that you should know that should send shivers down your spine if you hear these 3 words: Grand Theft Auto.
After Far Cry, the developers at Crytek wanted to make something different and ended up signing a deal with EA to develop the Crysis series, leaving the Far Cry games in the hands of Ubisoft, who put their team at Ubisoft Montreal to work creating spin-off versions for the Xbox. However, consoles being so weak in those days meant that they couldn't handle the wide open spaces of the PC release, so instead more linear levels were created and some story elements were changed. This resulted in Far Cry Instincts, which was loosely based on the original PC game, and then the follow-up Far Cry Evolution and the graphical remake Predator. All of these games were fairly successful, and Instincts was even put onto the Wii under the name Far Cry Vengeance, where it received a couple of new levels. Eventually, after spending years creating spin-offs, Ubisoft would finally start work on a true sequel, and Far Cry 2 was born. Depending on who you ask, this was either the best game in the series or the worst, but something everyone agrees upon is that it was very realistic. Weapons would degrade and jam. It included a day-night cycle and dynamic weather. If a fire was started, it could spread based on wind direction and which materials were nearby. Gameplay mechanics such as saving and fast travel were also very limited, particularly on consoles, and of course you're suffering from malaria throughout the entire game.
Oh, you're not well. You should see a doctor before you really need a priest.
The setting was also very realistic. This time you're in Central Africa, and a lot of effort was put into making it seem as true to life as possible. Some of the game's development team even spent 2 weeks camping out in Kenya to get a better idea of the setting. The realism gave the game a lot of harsh rules that you had to follow to have any real hope of success. For example, ammo was quite limited, so to avoid wasting rounds, players would first wound an enemy, so that you could easily pick off his allies as they came to help him. One of the most interesting things about the game is that it doesn't sugarcoat the fact that you're essentially a mass murderer. It even goes as far as to actually say that people believe I'm the devil himself in your reputation level. You're in a civil war, and although your mission is to assassinate an arms dealer called the Jackal who's been selling weapons to both sides of the conflict, the atrocities you commit to complete this objective are pretty horrific.
People back home say they want to help. Every day I hear it in the paper, on the radio. But they're lying. They're not ready to do what's necessary. They wear their halos and they stand by wringing their hands. You and me, we found a way.
The story didn't grab everyone, but for me, the most interesting part was that during your interactions with the Jackal, you realise that you're essentially the same person. He's just further down the road than you are. As the game goes on, you understand more and more about where he's coming from. You've slaughtered hundreds of people and aided both sides of the conflict. You're no better than he is. In the end, it's the Jackal who offers you both some kind of redemption for your terrible acts. The two of you must each perform a task.
I planted some dynamite out there, by that overhang on the cliff. But the deck cord's no good, so one of us has to go up there and short-circuit the blasting caps. That car battery will do the job. Let it be will block the road, keep the soldiers from following the refugees. And it'll kill the poor bastard that takes the job. That's either you or me. The other guy's gonna take those diamonds to the border and use them to bribe the guards, so there's no problems with the crossing. Those civilians are making it to the camps tonight, every last raggedy one of them. Then when the handoff's complete, that guy, you or me, is gonna put a bullet into his own head. I'd do both jobs myself, but there's not enough time. The only way this is gonna work is if we see it the whole way through to the end. Every cell of this cancer has to be destroyed. That includes you and me. If we don't finish this, then the whole mission has been a waste, a farce. It'll start up again just like it always does.
At this stage, the Far Cry series was moving along quite nicely, and the design elements found in Far Cry clearly influenced other games coming from Ubisoft, such as the highly successful Assassin's Creed. In fact, it was during the gap between Far Cry 2 and 3 that Ubisoft found its formula for open world games that I'm sure you all recognise. They have towers to climb, various collectibles to find, and some crafting or other RPG style progression. We'd already seen a few games using this formula, but it was still fairly new when Far Cry 3 released in 2012.
You guys think you're crazy, huh? Jumping out of airplanes, flying like birds. That is crazy. I like this phone. This is a nice fucking phone.
The game was a critical and commercial success, selling over 10 million copies in its first couple years, and for many gamers, it was their introduction to Far Cry.
Hey! You fuck! Look me in the eye! You're my bitch. I rule this fucking kingdom. Shut the fuck up, or you die.
At the heart of this game was the charismatic and crazy villain Vass.
Why aren't you laughing now like you did up there? What, is this not fun anymore? Have I failed to entertain you? You see, the thing is, up there, you thought you had a chance. Way up in the fucking skies, you thought you had your finger on the pussy trigger. But hermano, down here. Down here. You hit the ground.
Instantly recognisable, it was at this point that the promotional material for the Far Cry games shifted from showing the protagonist to focusing on the villain. However, all this success also came with more scrutiny, and a number of articles were published accusing the game of racism, thanks to its rich white protagonist essentially slaughtering the tropical island's pirate population. However, really all that did was draw more attention to the game, and with this coverage, we saw the future of Far Cry take an interesting new path. Whether intentional or not, the promotional material began to walk the line where it generates just enough press to give the game attention, but without doing anything so extreme as to actually cause real outrage. Something we saw a little bit more of with Far Cry 4, but is really heating up with the latest game.
I am your father.
However, before Far Cry 4, we got Blood Dragon, a standalone expansion for the game that was essentially a spin-off with no ties to the rest of the series. Based on 80s action movies, it was a huge success and became the fastest selling downloadable title in Ubisoft history, and winning many awards. So with two back-to-back hits on its hands, expectations were high for Far Cry 4's release in 2014.
I hate when things get out of control. One fucking chapter, you couldn't fucking do that!
However, depending on who you ask, it was either a resounding success or a complete disappointment. You see, the problem at this stage in Far Cry's history was that Ubisoft had been using the same formula for their open world games for a number of years. Be it Assassin's Creed, Far Cry or Watch Dogs, they all used the same mixture of climbable towers, collectibles and side missions. As a result, there were a lot of mixed reviews. Critics who generally looked upon the game as an isolated title were fairly positive about it, although still giving out lower scores than Far Cry 3. Users, however, were a lot more critical, many saying it didn't live up to its predecessor and the generic Ubisoft formula had now worn thin and needed to be refreshed. However, two things that were almost universally liked were the location and the villain.
Oh, would you hold this? For just a moment, I want to get a little picture right into the camera. There we are. Awesome. Don't worry about a thing, my boy. This will soon be behind us, and we'll be off on our grand adventure. Because I have cleared my calendar for you. You and I are gonna tear shit up!
The inspiration for the game having a similar setting to Nepal came from two desires. The first was verticality. They wanted somewhere that they could play with heights some more than the open savannas or tropical islands seen in the previous games. And the second desire was to include elephants, making Nepal the obvious choice. Then the main villain this time around was Pagan Min, who really stole the show.
So, fresh start. Introductions. Ajay Gale, our guest of honor. Paul, our very gracious host. The little monkey, whose name I still don't know. And I, of course, am Pagan Min. You really don't remember me, do you?
There is certainly an argument that Vaas was better, but regardless, Min was still one of the best parts of Far Cry 4, however he did still bring about his own controversy. This was another example of Ubisoft carefully walking the line of controversy, and while I'm sure officially it was unintentional, Far Cry 4's box art made a lot of headlines around the world with accusations of being racist. It was unveiled at a time when details about the game were almost non-existent, and without context, it's understandable that some people were offended seeing a dark-skinned man kneeling at the feet of a fair-skinned man who's surrounded by weapons and sitting on a destroyed religious-looking statue. The game's director responded by pointing out that Pagan Min wasn't actually white and that he also wasn't the game's protagonist.
It is the end of the Ice Age, and death for man comes swift and often.
Following on from Far Cry 4, we saw the release of Primal, a complete departure from the usual games and is probably best described as a spiritual predecessor to the rest of the series. Guns and grenades are swapped for bows and clubs, which, although an interesting idea, alienated a lot of the core player base. Also, confusion around whether this was a spin-off like Blood Dragon or a core part of the series also caused some problems. Although initial sales were good and Ubisoft stated the game had performed better than expected, it still ended up being the most poorly reviewed game in the series, and Steam Spy shows it having nearly half as many players on PC than Far Cry 4.
Chuta Marita!
Although the setting was drastically different to the previous games, the villain was not up to the standard that players had come to expect. This, combined with more of the same Ubisoft open world formula, caused the game to be accused of being a Far Cry 4 reskin that was rushed to be released to compete with other popular games with a similar prehistoric theme. And that brings us to today and Far Cry 5, the latest in the series and likely to be the most controversial. Exotic and remote locations have been swapped for rural Montana, where a religious cult has taken over Hope County, led by Joseph Seed, the larger-than-life villain who looks to rival Vaas and Min for the biggest crazy in the series.
What God gives, no man can take away.
Of course, due to its location on American soil and the use of religious fanatics, the trailers for the game drew a lot of attention from the media, as well as a petition on Change.org which objected to what they called the portrayal of American Christians as villains, and actually went so far as to call for the game's antagonists to be recast as Muslims or other non-white villains. Personally, I really hope the petition was satire, but sometimes it's kinda hard to tell.
No. This place is ours.
Ubisoft have been very careful to downplay any connections to current real-world events, stating that the story was written to discuss the consequences of beliefs and ideologies being taken to their most extreme, rather than the game being a response to any particular political or social event. Either way, once again, we get to watch the Far Cry series walk the line of controversy, and I'm sure it will draw more eyes towards the game, which right now is looking great.
I may never have gone to war. If them Peggies come after my family, sure as hell will give them one.
It seems they're stepping away from the old Ubisoft open world formula, already announcing that the game won't include radio towers to climb. There will also reportedly be no minimap, instead encouraging players to explore the world rather than just run directly to a pinpointed location. Throw in what looks like a great cast of characters to interact with, some stellar graphics, open-ended gameplay, and an intriguing premise, and it appears that Far Cry 5 is getting back to what made the series great. All of this sounds very encouraging, and Seed looks like he could possibly be the best villain yet. But what do you think? Are you excited for Far Cry 5? What do you think about the controversies surrounding the game? Let me know in the comments below. As always, this is James for Curse, saying thanks for watching, and enjoy the game.